Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. I'm really pleased to welcome our speaker, Sam Steimle, who is a National Poverty Fellow. That is a postdoc program that IRP runs and places folks in HHS. So Sam is in ASPE, the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation. We actually have almost all of our National Poverty Fellows visiting us this week, so it's a very exciting time. It's like Christmas at IRP. And some of them during each visit present their research. Sam has a PhD in psychology. Here are some of them. Subtly. Sam has a PhD in psychology from Georgetown and is going to be sharing research that I think is representative of the kind of work that degree led to, which is work on how government policies and programs make a difference for the economic and psychological well-being of families. So Sam has asked that we ask questions during the presentation and hold substantive questions till the end. So
appreciate it, Sarah. I'm going to do my best to project, but if you can't hear me in the back, now hold your piece. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here sharing some of my dissertation work today that I just defended a few months ago. So this is fresh off the press, and I welcome the wealth of knowledge in this room. Your feedback on my work is really welcome. So thank you all for being here. Okay, well, let's get started. Sarah pretty much introduced the topic, so I'm just going to jump right in. So before I get into cash assistance, I just kind of want to start by zooming out and talking about the kinds of issues that this study seeks to address. So this won't come as any surprise to anybody in this room, but one of the strongest predictors we know that of how a child will develop is their family's income. And not having sufficient income in particular is a risk factor for challenges in nearly every domain of child development, from health issues like malnutrition to compromising the ways that they interact with their peers and their teachers, and even having the potential to negatively affect how well they do in school. And one of the reasons that these differences tend to emerge between higher and lower income kids is that having a low income creates economic hardships like not having enough food to eat, stable housing arrangements, and even things like the inability to afford educational toys and experiences. These are all things that money can buy that are good for children, and a low income family struggles to afford these things. But having trouble affording basic expenses is also deeply distressing to parents. It often comes at the cost of their physical and mental health. So in particular, we know that low-income parents are more likely to experience psychological issues like anxiety and depression. This is a problem not only for them, but it also can compromise their ability to be sensitive and responsive caregivers to their children. And these parent-child interactions are really the building blocks of child development. So this is another way that we can see that low income can further undermine children's well-being. For the purposes of this talk, I'm not going to focus on all of the economic hardships. I'm just going to focus on one that's particularly distressing to parents and children, which is food insecurity. And just so we're all on the same page, food insecurity, by definition, is when a household doesn't have enough money to afford enough food or the kinds of food necessary for all the household members to lead a healthy life. I'm also going to focus on just one aspect of parent and child well-being, namely their psychological well-being. So for parents, we're talking more about mental health problems like anxiety and depressive symptoms. And for kids, thinking more about their behavior, both internalizing and externalizing ones. Another reason that I'm focusing on these outcomes is because they were all greatly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. I think we all remember and know that the pandemic precipitated a pretty widespread economic crisis, with job loss, unemployment, thrusting more people into having a low income than ever before. And for the families who are already low income, the loss of food assistance like free school meals made food insecurity and its harmful correlates even worse for a lot of families. But it's not all bad news. Fortunately, there are policy solutions specifically devised to kind of break this cycle, the most direct of which is cash assistance. So cash is a particularly helpful policy tool because it can be used for the wide-ranging needs that families have. But unconditional cash is not something that's typically used in the US. Usually the US relies on what are known as more conditional cash policies, like a tax refund that's conditional on work, or in-kind transfers like SNAP, which are cash-like benefits, but can only be used for specific things. In the case of SNAP, food ingredients. And these are hugely beneficial programs to families, but they do have a harder time reaching families because families need to show proof of work in the case of tax credits. And in the case of food stamps, they're less flexible when other needs besides food arise. Unconditional cash usually doesn't have that same burden of proof and can be used for anything that families need. So it follows that, providing families with cash gives them more money to spend, which they can use to alleviate economic hardships like food insecurity, and that can provide psychological relief to both parents and children. And there's a huge literature that spans decades and continents that links cash assistance to higher food security and better parent and child well-being. So in light of the economic and psychological hardships that families were facing during the pandemic, and this historically pretty positive body of literature, the US government turned to cash assistance during the pandemic to support US families. And one of the largest packages that was passed during the pandemic was the American Rescue Plan Act in early 2021. And it provided two different forms of cash assistance to families. The first was the economic stimulus payments. This was a one-time payment that amounted to $1,400 per household member, and it was distributed in March of 2021. It also included an expansion to the child tax credit, which was distributed as a monthly payment amounting to $250 for each child 6 and over, and $300 per month for each child under 6. And that was distributed from July through December of 2021. So the emerging evidence on these two payment forms finds that they were associated with higher food security pretty overwhelmingly. But the parent psychological well-being findings are a little bit less clear. Some studies are finding null associations, while others only find small positive ones. And no studies yet have examined how these two payment forms are related to children's psychological well-being. I also just want to take a second to note here that there is a growing, more experimental recent research on cash assistance that's been documenting more null effects on parent and child well-being, and in some cases even economic well-being. So in an effort to kind of reconcile some of these newly mixed findings in a sea of pretty historically positive literature, I explore in this study whether different forms of cash assistance can contribute to these indicators of family well-being in different ways. So with that, I have two main research questions I'm going to answer. First, I'm going to look at how a large lump sum payment, like the stimulus checks, relate to food insecurity relative to smaller regular payments, like the monthly PTC payments. And then I'll just examine the same question using parent and child psychological well-being as my outcomes. So before I jump into how I answer this question, I first want to talk about why we might expect there to be some differences in the effects of these different cash delivery formats. So I'd like to pretend that this greenish line here is kind of the amount of money that a household needs to cover their basic needs. So their food, their housing, their clothing. In here we have a low-income household who's not making enough money to cover those basic needs. So if we were to provide this family with a one-time lump sum of cash, it would bring their family's income well above the usual income line, allowing them to afford not only basic expenses, but more than that. So it lets families address a wide range of economic needs. But because it's only a one-time payment, this income boost likely would only be temporary, and families would kind of drop back down to this low income once the lump sum is fully spent up. Accordingly, we might expect that families' food security would follow alongside this path, where they're really food secure initially, but the levels sort of decrease over time as money runs out and returning back to its low level. And part of the reason we think this is because research shows that low-income families tend to spend money pretty quickly when they receive it because they have such pressing economic needs. It's really hard to save for tomorrow and a week from now when you don't have enough for today. And we would expect psychological well-being to follow alongside this same pattern, initially very high upon receipt, but kind of declining as the money runs out. And there is indeed evidence that the effects of a lump sum payment on both food insecurity and psychological well-being tends to be short-lived within a year. But we would expect that regular payments would incite different patterns of food insecurity and psychological well-being. So if we return to this original model, if we were instead to provide this family with a series of smaller regular payments, it doesn't have the power to hugely alter families' income levels at one time, but instead it may be enough to bring families' income level up to just the amount that they need to cover their basic goods over a longer period of time. And this in turn would contribute to smaller but more stable changes in food security relative to a lump sum. And we would expect to see the same patterns for psychological well-being. And there's a lot of evidence that finds that regular payments are associated with better food security and better parent and child psychological well-being in the longer term. But when evidence looks at more short-term associations, it finds that these effects are only stable when the regular payment amount is large enough to bring families up to this level of being able to afford their basic needs. But if the payment amount is not very large, families are still better off than they were, but they're still struggling to afford their basic needs. So yes, regular payments have the potential to promote more stable food security and psychological well-being. Also, getting relatively small amounts at a time may just contribute to spikes and declines in income, similar to what we saw with the lump sum, just happening on a smaller scale. And research finds that food insecurity and psychological well-being do tend to follow alongside these spikes and dips in income with respect to small regular payments. So these are precisely the patterns that I investigate in this study, using the stimulus check as my lump sum payment and the monthly child tax credit as my regular payment form. And as I mentioned, I'll examine food insecurity as my outcome in research question 1, and parent and child psychological well-being in research question 2. But to be able to answer these questions requires frequent data on both food insecurity and parent and child psychological well-being before and after each of these payment forms were distributed to be able to capture these shorter term associations. If we were to just average these associations out, they might not actually look that different from one another, and we would be obscuring all that underlying variation that I just went over. But something you might be thinking is, well, why do we care about short-term associations? And I would argue that they're important for us to understand because they more accurately capture families' lived experiences. You know, families might be better off on average over time after receiving cash, but if they're experiencing a great deal of instability in their levels of food insecurity and psychological well-being in the months and weeks following receipt, that would mean that the cash is insufficient to stably produce these changes in family well-being. And that's important for us to know because even short-term spikes in food insecurity have been linked to pretty consequential outcomes, like kids' test scores and their disciplinary infractions at school. So understanding these short-term associations can help us better understand how families are experiencing cash in real time, and therefore better tailor cash supports to meet their needs. Okay, so I'm gonna now talk about the data that I used to answer these questions. I relied on 2 data sets. One some of you might be familiar with, which is the Rapid EC data set, and one that was a personal data collection from my lab known as the PowerPack study. So these were both longitudinal studies that frequently surveyed families with children before and after stimulus and CTC receipt, and they asked questions about food insecurity and psychological well-being for parents and kids. But that's kind of where their similarities end. They're mostly very different from one another, which is why I'm analyzing them separately, and I'll talk through those differences. Okay, so first and foremost, RAPID is a national study that surveyed families across the US, while PowerPacks is a study that only surveyed local families in 2 counties in Pennsylvania. Another huge difference is the RAPID study has a much larger sample. My analytic sample was around 3,300 families, while PowerPacks it was only about 150 families. And that has to do with the intensity with which the data were collected, which I'll also talk about. Another key difference is that about half the families in the national sample are low income, while all of the families in this local sample are low income. The samples are also fairly different in terms of their racial and ethnic makeup, with the predominant response for the national sample being white and the predominant response for the local sample being Latinx. These groups also look really different in terms of their education levels, with 2/3 of the national sample having a college degree or more, and 2/3 of the local sample having a high school degree or less. So it's just important for us to keep these broad differences in mind as I talk through the results, keeping in mind that the PowerPack sample is a small, highly socioeconomically disadvantaged set of families, whereas the RAPID sample is a larger national set of families. They're slightly more advantaged and have a wider array of income levels. In terms of who's answering these surveys, about 90% of the time it's the mom, and that was true across both samples. But the age of the child that they're answering questions about, the focal child for the study, is quite different. It's around 3.5 years old for the national sample and around 8.5 years old for this local sample. And that's because the national sample specifically surveys families with children under 6, whereas this local sample was specifically surveying families of elementary school age children. So for the most part, we're gonna be focusing on these two, moms answering questions about themselves and this focal child for each of the samples. But there are also other people in the household. This household had 4 people total, with 2 adults and 2, sometimes a third child. And we don't know a ton about this second adult. It could be a father, a grandparent, aunt, or uncle. Really, we just know that it's a second adult. And this is important for us to know because household size directly informs how much money families got from each of these payment forms alongside their income levels. So families in the national sample, for instance, got about $4,000 on average from their stimulus checks and about $500 per month from their CTC checks. Whereas this local sample got about $6,000 in stimulus checks and around $600 in CTC checks per month. So these are pretty large sums of money that families were receiving, particularly in the context of the poverty level for a family of 4 being around $26,000 in 2021. So it's important to note that this amount can make up a pretty substantial portion of a family's income, but it's also still an income supplement, not an income replacement. $6,000 isn't really enough to live off for a year, but it does give families a boost and allow them to do a lot of things they ordinarily can't do.
Is the average stimulus for the Power Packs group, is that because there were more people in the household that it's higher, or is it?
It's because they're a lower income sample and the phase out rate.
Yeah. Okay.
How were participants recruited in?
Yeah, good question. So for the national sample, it was a more widespread effort. Like there were like Facebook advertisements, local advertisements in the paper, kind of a more like snowball sampling kind of approach, I would say. Whereas this local sample was specifically, we had started this data collection effort in 2020. This is kind of getting down a rabbit hole, but we started this data collection in 2020. We were looking to evaluate a local food assistance program. We ended up getting more money to continue following these families after they left that food assistance program because it became of interest to us to continue following them throughout the pandemic because we didn't anticipate it hitting. So that was kind of the initial recruitment strategy. Okay. So the study also collected data in really different ways. And you've probably heard me saying we a lot for the Power Packs data because I did help collect these data, which was not true for the rapid sample. So remember, we're only talking about around 150 participants here, but what we did was we split the sample of participants in half, and we had this first half of the sample answer 2 weeks of daily surveys starting in mid-January of 2021. And then when that group finished, they took a 2-week break, while the other half of the sample answered daily surveys for 2 weeks. And then when the second group finished, the first group came back on and answered 2 weeks of daily surveys again. And this continued on and on throughout most of 2021, which gave us survey data every day in 2021 until the end of October, when we basically ran out of money to keep studying these families. So yes, the sample is quite small, but there are a lot of data points per person, ranging from as few as 1 to as many as 140 responses per person, with the average being around 100. Okay, so let's contrast this to the rapid sample, which remember we're talking about thousands of families here. So pretend that this 9 people that I have here are thousands of families. So basically what participants would do is complete a baseline survey to ensure that they were eligible for the study. And if so, they were added to this larger participant pool. And then every 2 weeks, a random subset of people were sampled from the pool of participants to answer survey questions. And then a new sample was randomly sampled from this pool 2 weeks later, and another 2 weeks after that. And so this random sampling procedure means that the number of survey responses for each person varies pretty widely. So in this sample of 3 surveys, we see 1 person with 1 response, some with 2, and some were sampled at all 3 time points.
It's a pooled cross section. It's not longitudinal. Okay. Thanks.
But I'm doing some longitudinal work with the cross section because there are people who have provided a lot of data points. Yeah. Yeah, families were randomly sampled across all of 2021 every 2 weeks. So yeah, we're talking about a pretty large sample here relative to the local sample, but fewer responses per person compared to the local sample, with as few as 1 to as many as 26. So some people were randomly sampled at every single time point because of this data collection strategy. So yeah, I point these differences out because there are some longitudinal analyses that I'm able to do with the local sample that I'm not able to do with this national sample. This data set is really well suited for descriptive trends over time, but I'm a little more limited in terms of some of the longitudinal analyses that I can conduct. So I kind of view them as like a complement to one another in this study. Okay. So families in both samples were sent survey questions via text message. Here are the food insecurity questions that families were asked. Both samples asked questions about what we consider to be less severe experiences of food insecurity. So the food that they bought just didn't last, and worry about food running out. They were also asked about more severe food experiences, like when a family member reduces their food intake. Each of these questions are just a yes or no, and then I also created an overall sum score of these items to provide a sense of a family's overall level of food insecurity. And I'll talk about both the sum score and the individual items where it's relevant. Parents were additionally asked, sorry, did you have a question?
I did. So with your local sample, since these were somewhat older children, 8.5, 6.5,
8.5 is the average, yep.
And the larger sample is going to be national, and it's going to be children under 6.
Yep.
So should we be thinking about how school, like meals at school, might be supplementing maybe some food insecurity or security for the local sample?
Yes. So there's like kind of a lot going on in the differences. So there's also the local sample is also much more disadvantaged. Much more of the families are experiencing food insecurity. But yes, unfortunately, in the national sample, there wasn't great data, at least at the time period I was looking at, on what kinds of food assistance supports families access. So this was something I was also interested in, whether they're getting WIC or SNAP or other food assistance supports. There wasn't great data, at least at the time of this data collection. So I'll talk about food assistance a little bit more so in the case of the local sample because we had better data.
It seems to me it would be good to know if there were intervening events during this period, like somebody got sick with COVID, somebody was dying and whatever, because food insecurity can affect psychological well-being, but all the first looks at the stuff COVID dominated everything. That's what people were afraid of, and no one's working and so forth and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have any other correlates like that? Do you have health information on the households? I'm just trying to think of teasing out
Yeah.
your bottom line just based on food insecurity when there could be something else going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So unfortunately, we don't have great data at the individual level. Something that I'll talk about in a little bit is I did have access to this data set, this publicly available data set that was pretty good, that looked at rates of COVID infections within each state over time, month by month, and how restrictive the COVID policies were in each given month. So I will talk about how adding in that control changes some of my results a little bit. But yeah, I don't have whether a specific individual was sick. So parents were also asking questions about their psychological well-being. Both studies asked about parent mood, so symptoms of anxiety, depression, irritability. And then there were some more study-specific questions, like parents were asked about their emotional well-being in the national sample, like their stress levels and their loneliness. Whereas the local sample, we asked some questions about parenting behaviors, so whether they lost their temper with their child or punished their child that day. And then finally, both samples asked pretty comparable questions about their child's behavior, altered slightly because of the difference in child ages. So one question was each asked about internalizing behaviors, like the child's level of anxiousness or sadness, and one about kids more externalizing behaviors, like how fussy they were that day or their misbehavior. Okay, and then here's the longitudinal model that I used to answer both my research questions. So I ran separate models using all the outcomes that I just discussed: food insecurity, parent psychological well-being, and child psychological well-being. So that is each of our Ys, which varies by individuals, I, and time T. And kind of my main estimator of interest here is this beta 10 through K0 term, and that's a K because there are a different number of months across the two different samples. And basically what this allows me to do is compare how each month after cash receipt compares to the time before families received any cash. So for instance, for the stimulus checks, I can look at levels of, let's say, food insecurity, the month that families received their stimulus check relative to the time before they got any cash. I can look at 1 month after compared to this pre-cash period, and so on and so forth. And then I can do the same with the monthly CTC payments, looking at rates of food insecurity, the July CTC payment month relative to this pre-cash period, and continue for every month of CTC receipt. Although there's some caveats to that, as I mentioned, unfortunately, our data collection with Power Packs ended at the end of October, so I'm unable to continue looking at the additional CTC months in that sample. And for the national rapid sample, no food insecurity questions were asked in the December CTC month. So that's also a month I was unable to look at. Okay, so that was kind of our main estimator, but then I also parsed out other things that we know affect levels of food insecurity and psychological distress. So I include controls for how much money families were getting from both of their stimulus and their CTC payments. Some controls for parents' race and ethnicity and education levels. And then some things that were specific to each sample, like accounting for the wide income variability in the national rapid sample and child age. And in the local Power Pack sample, some controls for whether a family receives SNAP and a control for weekend days. But it's important to note, yes.
So in the rapid EC, the income to needs ratio is telling you something about other income sources in the household. Do you have anything in the local study that's telling you about other income sources in the household, or is that kind of being indirectly proxied by the stimulus amount?
Yeah, more so the latter. So yeah, we have self-reports of income in the local sample. It's not great data, but what we know from it is that all families would be low income with the reported amounts that they have. But yes, the stimulus and CTC amounts are directly informed by household size and family income. So I have it phase out for depending on what a family's income is. So there is a little bit of that variability captured in that variable as well.
So your stimulus payments are estimated. You're predicting what they are, but you're not actually.
Correct. Yes, because we did ask and got some answers that didn't make a lot of sense, and there's some work that suggests that the self-reports are pretty inaccurate in terms of how much families were getting. So I do estimate these amounts. Yeah. But yeah, so I have all of these controls, but I'm also only comparing individuals to themselves over time, right? I don't have a control group of a set of families who didn't get any cash. So there's no causality that can be assumed here. So the biggest threat is that something else besides cash, as Tim was saying, might be affecting these estimates over time. But one thing that I do to minimize these threats is I run a series of sensitivity tests where I control for changes in COVID-specific restrictions for each person's state over time. Like whether schools were open or closed, whether there were stay-at-home orders, COVID rates in the state, those sorts of things to see if the results change when I account for those external events. Okay. Okay, so before I break the patterns down month by month, I just wanted to show the kind of general linear trends over time. So this is our national sample, and what I've done here is basically just separated the trends by in food insecurity by income levels. We can see that the low income families experience the highest food insecurity rates at every time point, which is what we would expect to see. We also see a pretty intense drop in food insecurity following the stimulus payments. They remain pretty stably low, even when families got their CTC payments. And we really don't see any changes in food insecurity among this higher income sample, which I've roughly defined here as families 2 times above the poverty line. So what this doesn't tell us, is because these are just linear trends, is whether there's any variation in weeks in the months in the time after payment receipt. So what I'll do next is break down these results month by month to see if these declines are stably low as they appear to be, or if there's any bouncing around of the effects month by month. And since I only see any food insecurity changes among this low income sample here, I'm just going to focus on their food insecurity because spoiler alert, we still don't see any changes when I look at it month by month among the higher income sample. Okay. So here we're looking at the same time frame that I just showed. This first bar is the pre-cash period. So that's January through roughly mid-March before families received either cash support. And that's going to be our comparison report point for all of these months post-cash receipt that I'll be analyzing. So each bar represents the predicted level of food insecurity at this given time point for the average parent, so accounting for all those covariates that I mentioned. Okay, so now let's walk through the size of the declines that we see each month. So starting with the stimulus payments, compared to this pre-cash period, food insecurity was significantly lower every month following stimulus check receipt, except for 2 months later. And these effect sizes range from about 0.11 to 0.16 of a standard deviation, so relatively small effect size. Yeah, do you have a question?
Have you tested whether those effects are different from each other or not?
Yeah, I'll get to that. So these results are examining, the answer for this part is no, but I'll talk about where they are different. That's one of the kind of dynamics I'll go over. But yeah, this is just showing the sum score of all 5 food insecurity items. But as I mentioned, there are individual items that make up that sum score, and they do show some different patterns. So when I examine the most severe food insecurity item, which is hunger, we can see that this indicator is driving the results in the early months of stimulus check receipt. When I look at the least severe indicator of food insecurity, which is food not lasting as long as it should, we don't see any differences initially, but we see significantly lower rates in the later months post-stimulus check receipt. So taken together, these findings suggest that the stimulus payments were helpful with severe food insecurity initially, but maybe had some trouble maintaining these effects over time, and were only able to address less severe food insecurity as the money was spent down and ran out. Okay, so let's contrast the stimulus results with the CTC payments, starting with the sum score food insecurity items again. And again, we're still comparing to this pre-cash period. So I find significantly lower rates of food insecurity following the August, September, and November CTC months, but I don't see any differences in the July nor the October month. And again, these effect sizes range from about 0.15 to 0.18 of a standard deviation. So things look pretty similar so far compared to the stimulus check in terms of the longevity and the size of the effects. But again, we see some nuance among the individual items that make up this food insecurity sum score. So if we look at the most severe indicator of food insecurity, which was hunger, you can see that the results look pretty similar to the main pattern with decreases in some, but not all months. But the size of these effects do vary substantially across months, with this November decline being much smaller than the August and the September declines. Yeah.
You should totally ignore this if it's a silly question, but
Sure, it's
I
not.
feel like when I'm at a lot more. So do you think there has been any thoughts, for instance, thinking about how people's food intake need differed during this time period that you're looking at if they're staying at home?
Yeah, interesting. I haven't seen any research about that in the context of food insecure households. I'm not sure how much that would hold up in food insecure households who have trouble acquiring enough food and enough the quality of food needed. But I would guess that there is some work on that, but I'm just not familiar with it. Yeah. Okay, so let's compare that to the least severe indicator of food insecurity, which was food not lasting as long as it should. That was significantly lower nearly every month, again, with some variability in the size of these effects across months. So this variability in the monthly payments only being able to address severe food insecurity in some months, but less severe food insecurity in other months could mean that the per month amount is simply unable to address food insecurity when other pressing needs come up. Because if we had a sufficient CTC amount, we would expect these rates to be a bit more stably low. So for instance, in this October month, we don't see any changes in any indicator of food insecurity. And this was also the month where pandemic-related increases in SNAP ended. So it's possible families had a harder time addressing their food insecurity when they lost this additional support. But unfortunately, that was something I was unable to test in this data set. Yeah.
You know anything about SNAP receipt during this period?
This is one of my biggest gripes that I do not know in this sample. I know they
Got bigger.
have a question that was, do they have any access to food supports? And that included food banks, SNAP, WIC, like that was one question. It was not very predictive because it was too broad. But I do look at SNAP receipt in the local sample to be able to untangle the effects a little bit more.
SNAP, if you earn money and you get the EIDC, that reduces SNAP benefits. Neither the EIPs nor the CTC do SNAP benefits, and SNAP benefits went up.
Yeah.
For a couple of times during this period. There was a one-time bonus and then it was a permanent increase. So
Yes. Yeah, so the SNAP increases had begun before in this pre-cash period. There was an increase at the beginning of the year. And then the permanent change was at the end of October, but it was like following the end of the emergency allotment. So the research that I've seen has found that families got a little bit less money from the switch to the emergency to the permanent expansion. So that might be families kind of dealing with this shock of the change in amount.
Good.
Okay. So taken together, this national sample kind of paints a picture that the stimulus checks contributed to immediate reductions in food insecurity that appeared to fade over time, whereas the CTC checks similarly contributed to declines, but they seem to vary considerably across months in terms of their size. And for both payment forms, we only saw these effects emerge among the low-income families. So I'm going to turn now to the local Power Pack sample to see if there are similar findings. And so we don't have to walk through that whole thing again. I'm going to cut to the chase. The answer is yes. The results are quite similar. We see immediate declines in severe food insecurity that gradually fades over time following the stimulus check receipt, and more inconsistent associations across food insecurity indicators and months with CTC receipt.
Should the response rates vary over month in the national sample?
Good question. I don't think there are significant differences in response rates because they're randomly sampling people. In this PowerPack sample, we did have survey attrition over time because we were asking the same people all the time, the same questions. But it was still pretty high by the end, like 60% of families were still responding by the end of the survey period. But that is something that I looked at to see if the families who were answering by the end, if I just kept the sample to those families, and it didn't really change the results substantially. But yes, as I mentioned, something I was able to do in this sample that I unfortunately wasn't able to do in the national sample is look at these patterns by SNAP receipt. Because we would expect that food insecurity patterns would vary depending on whether families have a federal benefit that can only be used for food. And in our sample, we find that this pattern of results mostly occurs for families who are not receiving SNAP. And this makes some sense because SNAP families can only use their SNAP benefits for food. So at least in this sample, it suggests that these families tend to use their cash for other needs more. Non-SNAP families, on the other hand, have no source of federal food assistance, so they're more likely to rely on their cash to reduce their food insecurity. Okay, so that tells us the results across the national low-income sample look pretty similar to this local low-income sample, and that the declines are larger for families not receiving SNAP. But another question that I can ask using these local PowerPacks data specifically, because I rely on daily surveys, is whether these declines I'm seeing across months are consistent in the weeks within months. So what I mean by that is I kind of zoom in on only the CTC period here, and I basically just break each of these months down into 4 weekly indicator variables, and then collapse across these weeks to look at an average CTC month. Unfortunately, I can't do these same analyses with the stimulus checks due to me being unable to pool across over time due to that 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off data collection format that I mentioned, and there only being one payment. But the monthly payments is actually where we would expect there to be within month effects, for reasons I will talk about shortly. So just kind of extending that out to people can actually see it. This process basically enables me to understand how each week after CTC receipt compares to the week of CTC receipt. So by the week of receipt, I mean the day that families receive their check and the 6 days to follow, food insecurity rates look different. 1 week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later. And 3 weeks is the last week that I can look at because the next payment would be set to arrive the week after that. So part of the reason that I'm asking this question is because the SNAP literature has documented a pretty robust within month effect for monthly SNAP payments where food insecurity tends to rise as the time since benefit transfer has elapsed. We might expect to see a similar phenomenon for monthly CTC payments if the money gets used up before the CTC month ends and before the next payment is set to arrive. So this is just like a stylized example of what that pattern looks like. But let's see if this occurs in our sample with the CTC payments. And the answer is sort of. So again, we only see this phenomenon among the non-SNAP families in our sample. And that's in part because we know from the earlier results that they were the ones more likely to use their cash benefits for food. So what we see is among those not receiving SNAP, rates of food insecurity are pretty stable 1 and 2 weeks after receipt relative to the week of receipt. In the third week, rates of meal skipping, which is the most severe outcome that we measure, spike by 0.13 of a standard deviation. So, this suggests that month to month, parents are usually reporting lower food insecurity with CTC receipt, but within a CTC month, families who are not receiving other federal supports like SNAP tend to spend up the money before the next payment was set to arrive, and they'll skip meals to make ends meet until then. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the psychological results. Anyone have any questions before I do that? Okay, so returning to the psychological findings, again, I'm going to start with the national rapid sample. So here I'm showing a sum score of the parent distress items. So depression, anxiety, and stress kind of all combined. And overall, we see that parent distress declined upon stimulus check receipt, seemed to decline further in the time after receipt, and then sort of stabilized near that level with CTC payment receipt. Again, we see the stimulus check declines were greatest for the lowest income families who consistently experienced higher levels of distress compared to the higher income families. But it's worth noting that all families appear to experience declines in distress over time, whereas before I was only seeing food insecurity changes among the low income sample. Okay, so now let's turn to whether these effects were stable month to month. So this figure, I have the full national sample here since we did seem to see these effects across both higher and lower income families. So let's start with the stimulus checks. So compared to this pre-cash period, I find significant declines in parent psychological distress every month following stimulus check receipt. The size of these effects range from 0.15 to 0.28 of a standard deviation. And there are also significant differences between the size of these effects over time, and they appear to increase, suggesting a possible delayed effect of cash receipt translating to improved psychological well-being among parents. And that might make some sense because it could take time for parents to be able to address their many different economic needs at once. They can't address them all at once, so it might take some time for the psychological relief to follow. And we continue to see these effects be larger for the low-income families in the sample. Stimulus checks, these pattern of results looks pretty similar across the anxiety, depression, and stress items that we have. Okay, so let's turn to the CTC associations, again, looking at the full sample here. And I find significantly lower parent distress in every CTC month except for December. And these effect sizes range quite variably from as small as 0.09 in August to as large as 0.32 in November. And we again see these effects continue to be largest. These declines are largest for the lowest income families. But as I mentioned, the size of these effects really bounce around considerably across months. But that's partially because we do see some differences across the indicators that make up this parent distress score. So for instance, we actually find higher rates of parent anxiety in December and no significant difference in anxiety in August. And these times roughly correspond to back to school time and the holiday season, which can be really distressing times for parents, and there are times when a lot of expenses arise. So overall, this suggests that stimulus checks were associated with pretty consistent declines in parent distress that appeared to grow in size over time, whereas parent distress kind of bounced around considerably across the CTC months and depending on the indicator. Turning to the local sample, here I look at the parent item separately because they had pretty low reliability as a scale. So starting with parent worry and depression, much like the food insecurity findings, I find that these psychological benefits from cash were mostly conferred to the non-SNAP families in our sample. And we see a similar trend as I just showed with the national sample, where the psychological relief following stimulus payments is a bit more gradual. And we continue to see declines that vary in size across the CTC months. And the effect sizes are pretty similar in magnitude to those detected among the low-income sample and the national sample. And these results also look pretty similar for our other measure of negative parent mood in this sample, which was parent irritability. I can also ask this similar question of whether the monthly effects vary within a CTC month with respect to parent psychological distress, like I did with food insecurity. And I do find some small within month associations where parent worry and depression appears to be significantly lower in the following CTC receipt compared to the week of receipt. So this is just some more possible evidence to support the idea that it may take a little bit of time for cash to translate to psychological relief among parents. I also find significantly lower rates of negative parenting behaviors, so parents losing their temper and their punishment and use of punishment at every time point. But don't get too excited about these results like I did, because these findings are not very robust to alternative specifications. So when I include this control for changes in COVID restrictions over time, like whether school and work was open and closed, these behavioral effects entirely dissipate, and they don't look any different from how they were in the pre-cash period. And the same is true across both samples when I look at children's internalizing and externalizing behaviors. So any declines that I did detect fade once I control for changes in COVID-related restrictions over time, whereas all the other findings that I've detailed thus far have been robust to this control.
COVID restrictions in the national data are at the state level or at what level?
Correct, at the state level month by month.
And did you interact those with the, in addition to using those?
I did, and I don't fully remember what the results were, but they were sufficient that it didn't end up being an appendix in my dissertation. So I have the sense that wasn't the most interesting outcome. Yeah.
That surprises me.
Yeah. I think it absorbed too much of the variation, like because it was changing month by month, in addition to my main outcome being a month by month indicator, I think it was just like too much to ask of the model to be able to interact the two. if I remember correctly. There is one noteworthy child behavior finding that is pretty consistent, even when I do control for this COVID restriction variable over time. So when I look at within month changes in response to CTC payments, I find that children's misbehavior increases by 0.1 of a standard deviation 3 weeks after CTC receipt. And again, I specifically see this pattern among the families not receiving SNAP, which is the same set of families where I found increases in food insecurity in the same week. So this points to some evidence that, children may not be affected by cash receipt on average across months during a pandemic when more salient things are happening to them. But they may notice when money is tight within a month. Okay, so that was like a lot of results that I just walked through. I want to circle back to this model that I started with. So overall, I find more consistent evidence for lump sum payments in terms of families' food insecurity and psychological well-being when we're comparing them directly to regular payments. But that in part may be because I'm showing this model of families' basic needs as being linear, but families really don't have linear economic needs. The reality is that the things that families with children need really ebb and flow throughout the year. Expenses are higher when school is out and parents have to work out childcare and supplying meals, whereas school can take care of that for free for a lot of families during the school year. Kids need back to school clothes, the holidays are an expensive time. There are seasonal expenses that occur throughout the year that can make it more difficult for a family to stretch their income, particularly when it's low to begin with. So part of the reason why stimulus checks may have predicted more consistent food security and psychological well-being is because it lifts families' income levels up so far above their usual income level that they're more resilient to these varying expenses because they have enough money to take care of multiple needs at once. Families during this time can catch up on debt. They can buy things for their children that they ordinarily can't. And they don't have to choose between, whether they skip a meal today or whether they buy their children clothing with a lump sum payment. Monthly payments, on the other hand, do make families better off than they were, but they don't necessarily give families the same breathing room when other expenses come up. So it's possible we don't see the same consistency in food insecurity and parent psychological well-being because families are still struggling and forcing to make trade-offs between which expenses they can cover with a regular payment. They're still struggling to afford their basic needs often, which is something that's very cognitively taxing for parents. And I think that this quote sums up this idea really well. This comes from Tara Westover, who wrote a brilliant book called Educated. If you haven't read it, I'd recommend it. But for context, she basically leaves her survivalist family to go and obtain an education for herself at the age of 17. And she was working 2 jobs, one of which was a night shift, and then taking classes during the day, in addition to being a full-time student. So she talks about her experience when she received a Pell Grant after going through that for a year. She says, in those desperate years, a few $1,000s was enough to alter the whole course of my life. It contained a universe. It allowed me to experience for the first time what I now know to be the most powerful advantage of money, which is the ability to think of things besides money. That's what money does. It frees your mind for living. So, I think this is exactly the kind of relief that a lump sum payment is able to provide struggling families. It allows them to take care of large expenses that normally seem impossible to save up for and afford, and allows them to just get their heads above water. But this is not to say that regular payments don't work for families. On the contrary, I find that in more months than not, they're linked to lower food insecurity and better parent psychological well-being. But future research should explore increasing the regular payment amount to figure out how much money would allow families to be more stably secure and psychologically well off. There's lots of other future directions that this study inspires. Ideally, we would conduct a similar study, randomly assigning families to receive a lump sum versus a regular payment with a nationally representative sample, both of which were notable elements I was missing in this study. It would also be great to examine these payment forms outside the context of a pandemic, especially since I find that many of the parenting behavior and child outcomes are really explained by COVID restrictions over time, more than cash receipt. So it's possible cash might have more salience when there's not a life-altering pandemic going on. Additionally, I only looked at 3 buckets of outcomes: food insecurity, parent psychological well-being, and child psychological well-being. But it's very possible that cash relates to family well-being, always just not captured by these data sets. For instance, there could be increases in parenting self-efficacy, or a better parent and child relationship, or an increase in family meals. These are all things that can benefit children's development, but aren't necessarily the most policy relevant outcomes. But because the money can be used for anything, families are using it in some way, and research and policymakers may not expect that way. So I think it's necessary for us to examine a wider range of outcomes and do more qualitative work, particularly in the context of some more null findings. And I know that this is something that IRP is doing very well in the context of baby's first year study. Additionally, this study only looked at short-term effects, but it's possible that these different forms of cash could have different longer-term outcomes. You know, for instance, a family could buy a car with a lump sum that allows them to commute further to a better job, and that could have long-term benefits for parents and kids in ways that this work was unable to capture. So more work should examine how these different payment forms relate to both short-term and longer-term outcomes. I also, of course, need to talk about the really important study limitations of these studies. I'm going to talk about the big ones, but there are lots of them, and we can talk more about the other ones. So first and foremost, as I mentioned, it's not a causal design. I'm comparing individuals to themselves over time, but I can't rule out that there were other external factors that were influencing these trends over time that I was unable to control for. But I will say a strength of this study is the frequency of data collection, which meant that I could create time variables that were very specifically centered on when families received each of these payment forms. So these external events would have to happen at the same time as those events to substantially bias my results. I also think it's promising that at least some of the results were robust to the inclusion of this state-specific COVID restrictiveness variable, which gives me at least some confidence that the results were not substantially biased by other external events. I also want to note that the total amount of money that families received from each of these payment forms were different. So families got more money from their stimulus check relative to payments, which is obviously a potential confounder. But I will say that this relates back to my earlier point that, you know, what actually matters is the amount of money that families are receiving at each time point, a little bit more than the total amount families are getting over the series of months. So for instance, in the national sample, families would have needed one more CTC payment to equalize to their total stimulus check amount. But if we just gave families one additional payment, I would expect us to see more of the same effects that I detected in the first place. But another way to equalize the amounts would be to hold the time frame the same and to increase the amount of money that families were getting at each time point. In that case, I would expect the results to look quite different because we know families can address more needs at once with a larger amount of money. And we know families, particularly low-income families, tend to spend up money rather quickly when they receive it because of their pressing economic needs. So yes, it would have been ideal, I think, if the amounts were the same, but at least what my work and other work suggests is that what matters more is how much families are receiving at a given time point, rather than the total amount that they receive. And because of that, regular payments can just create a little bit more precariousness in these outcomes compared to a lump sum payment. So some policy implications I've been thinking about. The study suggests that, you know, because lump sum payments are good at addressing a pretty wide range of economic needs at once, they're well suited during times of economic downturns, which is exactly how we during the pandemic. But we also did start to see the Food Insecurity Association start to fade after a few months. So coupling a lump sum payment with a series of regular payments, which have the potential for longer term effects, is something I think the government did particularly well during the pandemic and should be considered in future policy decisions. I would also, you know, encourage the use of larger size, greater regular payments for some greater stability. But obviously we do not have unlimited government funds. I would also recommend from these findings that, you know, there be more coordination across government supports to understand how best to target this cash assistance. For instance, I find that low-income families and those not receiving SNAP benefited the most. And this is an area I'm really excited to be working on in my fellowship position at ASPE, where we're investigating ways to address child poverty more systematically across government programs and supports. You know, I don't think that cash can necessarily replace our existing social safety net, but I do think it's important to identify where the holes are to find places where cash can help to fill those holes. Relatedly, at least in my sample, the results suggest that SNAP really acted as a buffer against large swings in food insecurity and parent psychological well-being. So another policy consideration would be to expand SNAP. We know that only about 80% of eligible families receive SNAP, so removing some of these barriers to access could help families access this benefit that they're entitled to, which would free up other income for other needs. Okay, so I just want to conclude by returning to something that I alluded to earlier, which is that, you know, there's a noteworthy emerging experimental literature in the US that's not finding the same positive effects of cash assistance on parent and child well-being, and sometimes not even on economic well-being, which doesn't align with this work nor some of the overwhelmingly positive evidence that's come before it. And there are lots of differences between my study and these RCTs, one being that this is not the RCT, which makes them hard to compare, but I'm happy to talk about them. But these differences aside, I think, it's safe to say that we're at a pretty critical point in the cash assistance literature. And I think we need to take this new work very seriously, but I also don't think it negates all the work that comes before it. What I think it does prompt us to do is investigate sources of variation in cash assistance to help to untangle some of these varied findings. So, my view of these mixed results is that we need to take a step beyond the question of whether cash works and begin to investigate how cash can work best for families instead. And the studies from this talk at least suggest that delivery style may be one of the sources of variation that may matter for families. All right, that's all I have for you guys. Thank you. So you go first.
All right. Amazing, excellent work. Thank you so much. I have two questions. You can address any way you see fit.
One name with them one at a time. I always forget the second.
Okay.
Do a little question.
I framed it that way. So
Amazing.
it's a theoretical question to start. So you talk about the relevance of looking at this crisis point or several crisis points throughout the pandemic, but also knowing that there are long-term challenges that several families face, their family well-being and their insecurity, you know what I mean, as far as hunger and things like that. And so what implications at all do you think theoretically we could gain, as a field from understanding that for some families, there's crisis points that drive, right, factors related to hunger, family well-being, but for others, particularly those who receive federal programs and assistance, it's a challenge that's an ongoing challenge, right? So that's a theoretical question. So start with, okay.
Yeah, so I think this relates a lot to this dissertation, so thank you for asking the question. Yeah, I think we do need to kind of view those as separate problems almost, and that's kind of what I was alluding to when saying like the coupling of these two different forms of cash assistance is useful, because yes, there are crisis times, and that's when something like a lump sum payment might have the most bang for its buck because it gets cash to families quickly and they can use a lot of it to address a lot of needs that are happening at the same time. But yes, agree that that doesn't address necessarily the longer term implications for families who are pretty stably low income, which is where something like a regular payment would be better suited because it could provide more consistent cash receipt into the pockets of those families.
Yes. Okay. And then the B part, and you mentioned it in your last slide, the implications or future, right, around a wider set of outcomes. Yeah. So I'm really interested in your findings around family well-being, that were very significant. What are those asset or positive outcomes? You know what I mean? Because I'm interested based on what you think about the data set. Mm-hmm. What are the ways that families actively negotiated and made decisions that allowed them to continue to thrive as parents instead of the negative outcomes that a lot of time, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly. So this is something I wasn't able to look at in these data sets, but I do think it's an area where we need to move because I agree that there are like parents are receiving this cash. If it's not relieving psychological well-being, it might be acting upon different outcomes that we're just not seeing. So this is where I think qualitative work is really important to ask families how they're using the cash, whether they think it's benefiting them, in what ways.
How they're negotiating their parenting decisions throughout.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's not something I was able to test with these data, but it's something that I think we need to do more work to look at. Yeah, thank you.
This is just to go back briefly sort of to some of your final discussion points, but something that came up to me when you were talking about how the small low-income sample was using it. Mm-hmm. You said that we really only see the positive development of food insecurity over time, and in part because this group seems to be using it essentially as potentially a replacement step. And so I'm wondering, did you take any time at all to calculate if this particular group is eligible for SNAP and not accessing it? Because that also seems to be just in general, when you're talking about program access, a really critical question.
Yeah, I agree. So part of the reason why, yes and no to that. So I'm able to look at income-wise, whether they're eligible for SNAP. The sample that we were working with is a sample that it's a lot of Latinx families, a lot of immigrant families. So we don't ask any questions about citizenship to continue having trust with these families. But we do know anecdotally and from speaking with these families, many of the families are not citizens. There are concerns about the public charge rule and whether even though their children may be eligible for SNAP, they don't want to apply for it. So while yes, we might have some idea of whether they're eligible, there could be some sticky points that families are not applying for SNAP that we're unable to, kind of address. So, yeah. But I do think that may be why we're seeing the non-SNAP families in this sample be slightly more socioeconomically disadvantaged as well.
Okay, so the lump sum EIPs, fantastic job. I have paper with Robert Mopp, huge effects on poverty, bigger than lots of them. But there's a lump sum payment that you didn't talk about,
The ITC.
right? The EITC. And that could have happened right in March when you started along with it, but it's an annual, you have an annual lump sum from the EITC.
Yep.
And that allows you to do,
Yeah.
opt in for marginal things. And then hopefully at some point you have the regular a CTC that's fully refundable. And and the National Academy of Sciences panel on child poverty said the optimal was have both because you can serve both needs. Okay, but how did can you control for it? Can you find the EITC in?
So we don't have information on whether families reported receiving the EITC. I did do some estimates to guess whether families were eligible for EITC. Most of the low-income families would have been eligible for EITC. That actually wasn't the most helpful comparison when I did try to control for it, as it was almost all of the families would have gotten it. My one saving grace, I think, with the EITC is that we know low-income families who receive EITC file as early as possible to be able to get to the money as quickly as possible. So my hope is that in part it would buy us at least the pre-cash period a little bit more, because it would be February when families are applying to get EITC as soon as possible.
After really fast, but March is another.
February through early March, yes. But I do think it has a potential to complete some of the declines that I detected in the early months of stimulus check.
Look for the EITC, which is, I don't know, depends how many kids and everything, but it's big.
It's a
$6,000-7,000
lot of money.
in a state like Wisconsin, even, which has a state subsidy on top of it. Minnesota.
Yeah, so that's something I wish we had better data on. We had some data on whether families filed taxes, but that was answered really inconsistently. So families weren't really willing to provide that information to us.
Great job with the limited stuff you had.
Appreciate it. But at least if you talk about it, and when you're thinking about the discussion, that you're cognizant of it. And so what an implication might be then that whatever pressing needs families had that would have been addressed by the EITC in your before period makes them qualitatively less disadvantaged when your lump sum comes in here. So it
Less than the contrast.
Right, so it's the amount of money. So we might need more, you might need more money to get those effects because it's the masking the EITC effects on that first month. Is that right? Is that the way to think about it? Yeah.
I'm really excited to see this because for a very long time, I want more comparisons of lump sum versus cash transfers, and I've studied each separately, and it's great to see them studied together. One of the things that I was wondering about as I thought about the CTC estimates is whether they're still capturing some stimulus payments effects. When people do things like paying down debt, that means they have more credit that they can spend on later, or more of a grace period from a landlord that they can, delay paying a bill. We, in our qualitative work on the EITC, heard people talking about building a safety net for themselves through that kind of debt pay down, but also by buying things like food that, putting meat in a deep freezer, or buying canned soup and things like that they could keep for a really long time. And so I wonder about how much how much you're able to actually isolate the CTC effects because you have to look at them all in the same year.
Yeah, this is a great point. Definitely something I've thought a lot about. Two things that give me a little bit of hope that that's at least not going on too much is that some of the times when I did find there to not be significant effects on parent psychological well-being in particular tended to be in July and August. So I would think that if there were still conflating stimulus effects, at least on parent psychological well-being, that would have emerged in the early months of CTC payments. So that gives me a little bit of a sense of maybe that, those two payments aren't lining on top of each other.
You're running out of your stimulus resources. I mean,
yeah,
again, hard to tease them out, yeah.
Right. And I do think it's definitely possible, which is why I ended up comparing to the time before stimulus check receipt, because I was like, these are too conflated with one another. But something else that I think is, potentially interesting about this is, the stimulus payments were distributed at a time when families were not doing very well. That's why it was distributed, right? So part of it might be that even though they just got a stimulus payment 4 months before the CTC payments came through, it might be a more accurate estimate of how a CTC might operate in usual circumstances, not during a pandemic. So yes, I do think that there is a possibility of the two payments coupling together, but that might also look like how families actually would experience the CTC if it were enacted in normal times.
I thought that was an excellent presentation, just such amazing research, and I really love the slides. I have a question. Sense of whether or not people spent their money in different places when they got it as a lump sum. Like I can imagine if I had a lot of money, I might kind of, mount a trip to Walmart. Whereas if I just had a smaller payment, I might go to the local convenience store.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of my regrets, in addition to not having SNAP data in the rapid sample, is not asking families what they did with the money for the stimulus check. We did think to ask it for the CTC payments, but even that, families were kind of giving very varied responses, very inconsistent responses. So I don't know how much I necessarily trust that, but there is a larger literature, not just in these data, that finds that families very much do spend these payments differently. Lump sum payments tend to be spent on more durable goods, so things that are going to last longer, bigger ticket items because you can afford those things. Versus yes, regular payments do tend to be spent on more basic needs and non-durable goods because it's less money at a time. So
I have one other question.
Yeah.
I have a sense of why the effects on food security were so much smaller than the ones on family well-being.
yeah, interesting question. This is one I have not gotten before. I think in part because I have a couple of theories around this. I think the way that we measure food insecurity might not be the way that families think about food insecurity in some regards. I think families are focused on obviously making sure everybody in the household can eat. That is the first and foremost. But there's also this qualitative aspect of food insecurity, how healthy is the food that you're eating? How nutritious is it? And I think that might be something that, in the kind of laundry list of what are my priorities when I have not that much money, I think that piece might fall a little bit to the bottom of the list. Once families, everybody in the household is eating, I think the other aspect of food insecurity might, kind of matter a little bit less. And families are like, okay, I need to address these other needs before I turn to providing, food that's more nutritious versus just any food at all. That's one theory that I have. Yeah.
I'm thinking about one of the figures that showed that psychological distress for parents was lower each month for CTC, except for the very last one, December. And I can't remember, did families know that that was going to be the last payment, or was there the possibility that could be continued? And then I ask that because how do you think about program design then in terms of, do recipients know that how much information do they have about when something's going to be ending? They can be anticipating planning that versus the possibility of it sort of extending.
Yeah, very good question. Yeah, so at the point of December, at least nationally, I think there was still some that the CTC would continue being extended. I don't think we really knew for certain that it wouldn't be until January. So I do think there was some concern potentially around that. It's also not clear to me, I was obviously thinking a lot about it as a researcher who's studying these sorts of things. It's not clear to me how much families who were receiving the CTC knew about the expiration. I've seen some mixed work about whether that was something families were aware of. But I also think it was conflated with, it being the end of the year, holidays, stressful time. So that might also be another reason why we saw some different December effects. Yeah.
You talked about looking at the different COVID restrictions and opening up across different states, but the thing that jumps out at me is that March, April of 2021 was when vaccines were available.
Mm-hmm.
And anecdotally, i.e. me, I felt a huge sense of relief and feel like my psychological well-being was improved. Is there any way to gauge what kind of impact that would have had?
Yeah, good question. So in that COVID restrictiveness variable, actually vaccination was one of the elements of that. So yes, it was able to account for that, and it was also accounted for somewhat in terms of like COVID rates were going down at the same time, like those were obviously very interrelated. So yes, I do think that was definitely in part driving some of those parent psychological well-being effects, but they were still robust when I included that control. So not exclusively, but definitely something.
So I appreciated that you said a little bit about external validity at the end, but I would have liked more, I think.
Okay.
That especially if you're gonna draw policy implications for non-pandemic times, I think you would want to have a slide or two that tried to make an explicit substantive case for why we should treat results during COVID as being relevant to policy in non-COVID times. I guess my prior, and I'd like to hear your reaction, would be that I might be willing to port over the food security results more than I'd be willing to port over the sort of child behavior and psychological well-being results, just because COVID was such a mind bender in a way for things about what's in people's heads.
Yeah, I would agree with that interpretation, especially because cash is obviously very related to the ability to purchase food. It's a little bit more distal to parent and child psychological well-being. To the earlier point that was made about, the effects were larger, the relative effect sizes were larger for psychological well-being relative to food insecurity. I think that could very well be related to the fact that, yeah, there were a lot of other things going on with respect to parent psychological well-being during that time that might not exist during a non-COVID time. But yeah, I think we can, maybe put a little bit more purchase on the food insecurity findings for that reason. Yeah, good point. Did I see your hand?
Yeah. I was wondering if you have any like personal insight or like hypothesis, or if you are aware of any research that would be kind of looking at the psychological well-being from the child perspective themselves, right? Because you said 90% of the time answered by mom. Getting dad's perspective would give us an entirely different scenario as well. But also externalizing behaviors don't necessarily represent what a child is understanding in the world around them, and like if they feel like they have enough food. And I was just wondering if you have any like subjective data from children.
Yeah, thank you for asking this, because this is also one of the limitations that I didn't get a chance to discuss and I wanted to. Yes, obviously we are relying on parents' reports of children's behavior. Very much could affect what is actually going on with kids' behavior, because it's how parents perceive their children's behavior. Particularly when we're thinking about internalizing behaviors, that's a really hard thing for like a parent to see what's going on in their child's head, right? Unfortunately, like with at least this level of work, like we're texting parents daily, like there's not a great way to get that same data from a child. So yeah, I think there does need to be like more work done to understand on, from the child's perspective. I just don't know of a lot of work beyond qualitative work to get that perspective. We weren't able to do that in this study, but I think it is something that's important and maybe, could be biasing these results. So definitely something to think about.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, join me in thanking Sam for sharing the beautiful